Chapter 17, Caring for Others. Intro. Moral philosophy is concerned almost exclusively with men's moral experiences. This has caused contemporary feminist ethical theorists to argue that classical and traditional moral philosophy is distorted. Feminists criticize classical and traditional theory for 1. Assuming the notion of the isolated individual, independent and separate from everyone else. 2. They envisage the objective of moral philosophy as theorizing and explaining how individuals ought to treat each other. 3. Relying on theories concerning the development of a social contract as a way for the person to enter into moral relationships. 4. Emphasizing impartiality and universality in their ethical theories. Feminist ethical philosophers argue that basing ethical theory on the isolated individual and relying on social contract approaches does not reflect the reality and centrality of relationships or the notion of trust, which is grounded in relationships. Feminists also argue that traditional ethical theory ought to concern itself with the reality of everyday moral experience and detach itself from supposed notions of impartiality and universality, focusing instead on the conditions of life and the particularity of the human experience. A theory of development. Kohlberg wanted to understand why people would break a written law for a purpose they held to be a higher good. In Kohlberg's study, he introduced the Heinz dilemma, a scenario where Heinz's wife is near death and her only hope for living was a drug being sold by a pharmacist for $2,000. Heinz doesn't have the amount of money needed to obtain the drug, so the dilemma is whether he should steal the drug or not. An 11-year-old boy said that it is obvious that Heinz should steal the drug, explaining that a human life was worth more than money. An 11-year-old girl, on the other hand, disagreed with the concept of stealing in that situation and advocated the idea of borrowing money instead to avoid further conflict. Kohlberg concluded from the study that people pass through stages of moral development, achieving the fourth of 6 stages. He assumed these stages are universal, that they operate in sequence, and that they are irreversible. In a different voice, Carol Gilligan. Carol Gilligan suggests that Kohlberg's model is incorrect in explaining women's moral development because women have different moral stages than men. Gilligan argued that the boy and girl from Kohlberg's study thought differently and opposed the idea that the girl's way of thinking was inferior. Gilligan concluded that women, unlike men, tend to see moral life in terms of care rather than justice and in terms of responsibility rather than rights. Gilligan argues that means moral decisions are concerned with individual rights and autonomy, and that non-interference is highly valued, as it is the application of rights and rules to abstract hypothetical dilemmas. She also argues that in their moral decision making, women focus on relationships and interdependence and on feelings of empathy and compassion. The conclusion Gilligan came to was that the caring approach is an equally valid moral perspective that has generally been ignored in both moral theory and psychological research because of male bias. Gender and the ethic of care. The ethic of care conceives moral life as a network of relationships with particular persons, and it sees living well, living well as caring for those people within those relationships. The ethic of care rejects the idea of relying on rules to assess morality, regarding them as guidelines and not determinants of right and wrong. Holmes considers that the challenge of the ethic of caring is to decide what is morally correct in cases outside the scope of family and friends. Sloat argues that the ethic of caring can be sustained in the form of a specifically virtue ethical manner, as a form of virtue ethics. Sloat suggests that the morally most attractive or virtuous individual is one who has deep concern for particular others, but is also broadly concerned with the well-being of other human beings.